Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today, Mark versus Mark, the 1969 Continental Mark III versus the 1972 Continental Mark IV. Both the first years of these Marks. 69 was the first year of the Mark III. It would be produced from 69 to 71. And then in 1972, Lincoln would introduce this all-new 1972 Mark IV that would continue on through 1976 before the Mark V would take over in 1977. So we're going to discuss a little bit about the evolution of the Marks and which one of these would I say is the better vehicle. First thing to note is that, as I mentioned, this is a Mark III from 1969. And for those Lincoln historians, you may know that there was actually another Mark III in Lincoln's lineup, and that was the 1958 Mark III. The 1958 Mark III was just this big 131-inch wheelbase car with the canted headlights. I actually love those. I'd love to find one day. I haven't been lucky enough to find one in good shape. But that styling was pretty off-putting to a number of people, and even today it's still very polarizing. But that Mark III in 1958 basically became the Mark IV in 1959 and the Mark V in 1960. So Lincoln was incrementing the digits every year, and then that was dropped in 1961 when the Continental was introduced, the suicide door Continental sedan as well as the convertible. But Lincoln thought it was appropriate to just kind of forget about those Mark IIIs and Mark IVs from 1958 and 1959 and restart the numbering scheme, because these cars were more in the spirit of the Continental Mark II, which was another beautiful car. So the 69 Mark III came out in that model year, and it was the first year, as I mentioned, of that particular vehicle. And if you watch a video that I have with Mark where we compare the Mark III to the Thunderbird, this was basically a Thunderbird that was gussied up. And Lee Iacocca allegedly said, put a Rolls-Royce grill on the Thunderbird, and that was the brief he gave designers. And they did, and the car was hugely successful. Now you may see, how can you make a Lincoln out of a Ford like a Thunderbird? Remember back then the Thunderbird was a luxury car. It was not a mainstream car. Really, as the late 70s Thunderbirds, the downsized ones, came into vogue, that pushed the Thunderbird down market, and it became less of what it really was before that. Of course, the Thunderbird started out as a two-place convertible, and then it became a four-place vehicle. But even still, before 1977, I would say, the Thunderbird was still a luxury car from Ford. And so the platform upon which this is based is actually a really, really great platform. In 1972, this is also similar to the Thunderbird. You'll notice that it has the same windshield, the glass on the side here, the A-pillars, the roof panel, I believe even is similar across them. But it was an all-new Thunderbird chassis in 1972, and Ford really developed this more based on the Torino than anything. So a number of components, including the wiper transmission, the HVAC blower system, and I believe even some floor pan sections are similar to the Torino on this, and that's part of the reason why the gas tank fill on the Mark IV is actually underneath the license plate until they relocated it when the big bumpers came in 1974 to the driver's side like most Fords. So this wasn't quite as great of a platform, given that it was shared with the Thunderbird but shared a lot of components with the Torino. This did not share anything with the Torino when this came out. I will say, though, that in 1969, this car was a huge hit and really laid the foundation for this vehicle. The Mark III sold very well, given what this effectively was. The first time Lincoln was doing a personal luxury coupe. And they tended to sell around 25 to 30,000 units each year. So it was pretty successful, given that it is a gussied up Thunderbird, and a great one at that. However, when the Mark IV was introduced in 1972, despite its $8,600 base price, which was in the stratosphere for the time, the Eldorado had about a $7,200 to $7,500 base price, and it mostly because the Eldorado didn't come standard with air conditioning. But this was even more expensive in base price than the Eldorado. This car sold over 48,000 units in 1972, and the peak years for the Mark IV would see almost 60,000 units sold for a personal luxury coupe. 1974 was the top year in sales for the Mark IV, in a year right after the fuel crisis. Can you believe that? Most of these big cars were losing sales during that time period, but this was actually gaining sales. So A lot was happening during this period in Lincoln, and then when the Mark V came out in 1977, Lincoln actually sold, I believe, around 80,000 units of those. So it was even more popular. This Mark IV displaced Cadillac from the personal luxury coupe crown because Cadillac, remember, had an Eldorado convertible and a coupe at this time, selling for a lower base price, as I mentioned, and between both of those models, Cadillac sold about 40,000 units. So Lincoln topped the sales of Cadillac with a higher base price and with only a two-door coupe. So that must have smarted Cadillac a little bit. Let's take the camera off and talk a little bit more about these vehicles in detail and compare and contrast some of the features. We'll begin in chronological order with this 1969 Mark III. And as I said, this was based on the Thunderbird platform, but what a great platform it really was to start this vehicle. I will say if you drive one of these Mark IIIs and then you drive a car like the Eldorado in the garage, there's just no comparison in terms of the ride quality. This Mark III is so much smoother, quieter. The engine and transmission, I would say, between GM and the Ford product here are pretty similar in smoothness. Maybe even the GM's a bit better, especially the transmission shift smoothness is better in the GM. But everything else in terms of the ride and the build quality, I would say the Lincoln definitely takes top marks. You'll notice that this does have hidden headlights. There's two actuators on either side, so they don't open in tandem with one another, but they do, well, they open relatively in tandem, but not like the Mark IV that just has one actuator that opens both of these headlight doors. I will say you can see a lot of styling differences between these vehicles. Ford during this period, everything was pretty angular, and you could draw this car with a ruler and you'd be pretty successful. Take a look at the Mark IV though and see how much more organic the shapes are. You have this beautiful lead-in on the front fender, which on the Mark III you don't. It's just a completely straight line that actually, because it's so straight, your eye almost perceives it as though that fender tip is canted upward when it's really not. Here, Ford stylists did a great job with this beautiful lead-in, and then also out back you have this wonderful form, and you can contrast that with a relatively straight shape on the Mark III. Notice this is a very squinty greenhouse, not much glass here. It's almost modern-day Camaro-esque in its proportions, and when you're sitting in the car, you definitely don't perceive there to be a lot of glass area. And notice this car also doesn't have a passenger side rear view mirror, nor does the Mark IV. And with that chunky sail panel, it's a little bit tricky to navigate, but you get used to it after a while. I do love the wheel arches here that start relatively big, flare out, and then taper, both at the front and the rear. The Mark IV is a little bit similar, but different. And clearly they both have the so-called rooftop Lincoln hood that you can see there. They also have the Lincoln characteristic trough on the doors that Mercury would copy. Ford would not have this. So if you see an LTD, you don't have this kind of trough here. Notice there's no fender peak molding on the Mark IV, but on the Mark III it has it. Very subtle badging on both cars too. I don't know that that font size could get much smaller for either Mark III or Mark IV. This Mark III is powered by a 365 horsepower premium fuel 460 V8. Unfortunately, by 1972, that poor 460 cubic inch V8 would lose its high compression and would go down to just, I believe, 212 net horsepower. That is net horsepower for 1972. The rating system changed after 1971, and this is gross horsepower of 365, meaning it's rated without the exhaust, the air cleaner, and the accessories, while this is. But nonetheless, I would guess 365 gross horsepower, somewhere around 270 net. And this car is noticeably peppier than the 72 Mark IV. 72 is also not a great year for Ford 460s. They had a one-year-only D2 VE head that tended to spark knock even on regular fuel that they were supposed to run on. And aside from the spark knock, it didn't flow all that well. The other year cylinder heads for these 460s are indeed better. Notice that both of these cars have power antennas, though the Mark IV's is up here and the Mark III's is at the rear. The Mark III also has this wonderful feature of the flow-through ventilation system. You can open this vent and then the interior air will exhaust out back here, and it works wonderfully well. You could smoke a cigar in this and have the climate control running and it would suck all of the smoke out. This also does have flow-through ventilation system, but it doesn't have any venting on the trunk. One of the problems that Ford had was that venting leaked into the trunk after a while. But you can see that's where the exhaust is, which was pretty typical during the time period on the Mark IV for the passenger compartment. Let's take a look at the back, and you can see some similar features. Of course, the faux Continental spare tire hump, which is just decorative. There is no spare tire hump there. And notice that it's integrated into the bumper, and they did the same on the Mark IV. I think it's just a beautiful shape. In 1974, the Mark IV would lose that in the rear because of the bumper standards. In 1973, it would lose its beautiful front end, again because of the bumper standards, unfortunately. If we turn to the interior, this is where the Mark III really shines, and I would say just opening the door, I mean, a lot of these 70s cars have thick doors, but this car, I mean, this one is really bank vault in terms of its weight. And one thing that Ford did during this era on the Lincolns was use very expensive materials. That is faux wood grain in 1969. In 1970 and 71, it would go to real wood grain. And Ford would change the interior, including the door panels. The steering wheel would change many, many times on these Mark III's. But even so, this is just a rich, look at that gathered leather interior. And this was purposeful here, this kind of gathering. I call it puckering, which is not the correct term for it. But allegedly, these seats were being rejected by Ford Quality Control because they thought that that was an error. And it was actually something the designers wanted to give the car a rich look. So consequently, the back seat of this car, it doesn't have much of that gathered leather look. An absolutely beautiful headliner material, rich and luxurious. And this car also has this header panel up here with some warning lights for, are your seat belts fastened, is the door ajar, is the trunk open, and are your headlights doors working effectively. 69 was also the last year of these for funky key placement. Can you see where the key placement is? It's a great anti-theft feature. There it is down there. Ford would go to the steering column location in 1970. But just a wonderful, wonderful, rich interior. Now, let's contrast, and I love how the glass is trimmed as well up top. Also, I will say on the Mark III's, this rear glass retracts all the way into the sail panel and it goes horizontally. It retracts on the Mark IV's, but with the opera window, you can see it only retracts really not very much. So here you go. That's it. Even the opera window, or the cars without the opera window here, the rear window only retracts about 3/4 of the way. Now, in contrast to the Mark IV, let me take the key out so we don't hear that annoying buzzer. This interior was really a step down, I think. That door panel is just not as rich and luxurious. You have hard plastic down here and lots of faux wood grain. It just doesn't feel as rich overall. You do still have the super thick and plush carpeting. But these seats and the dash theme even, it's not my favorite. This faux two-tone wood grain, very boxy, picture framey. And this car on the inside, the Mark IV feels like it doesn't have much window glass area. The Mark III feels like it doesn't have much window glass area. The Mark IV even feels more squinty. And I will tell you, the most humorous thing about this Mark IV compared to the Mark III is the trunk. The trunk volume on this Mark IV is pitiful because that fuel tank is underneath there. This has the typical Ford deep well trunk. Let me go get the keys and show you what I mean. Well, here you are. The Mark IV trunk with this full-size spare fits basically a cover for the car. And that's about it. Whereas here you get the deep well 6-body trunk. Again, because the fuel tank isn't down there, it's mounted vertically on this vehicle. So in trunk size, the Mark III definitely wins. That's for sure. In the interior, the Mark III wins. In the power department, the Mark III wins. So where does the Mark IV win on any of these dimensions, if at all? I would say probably the only dimension where the Mark IV wins, frankly, is the styling. I think the Mark IV is a very well-styled vehicle, and as demonstrated by the sales of the year. But pretty much in every other aspect, this Mark III is a better car, and it feels more luxurious. You saw the comparison of the interiors, and the Mark IV also has an even softer ride than the Mark III, which is already soft, and it's kind of waterbeddy, almost to the point of being nauseating if you're driving on a road that has any bit of curvature to it. So really, it's the Mark III's game. And as you go down the road, wonderful smoothness. This is one of those cars where you don't hear or feel the bumps really. It's so waterbeddy in so many ways. Hey, that was a pretty big bump there, and you just don't feel anything. Ford had a great philosophy with the body mounting on these cars, and that was that they only mounted the body of the chassis at points from the package shelf backward and the firewall forward. And it really helped in terms of the overall intrusion. They also had lower control arm bushings with one pivot point and one bushing. They thought that that helped isolate the cars from the road, and frankly, it seems to. It works just great. You get one of these cars, you are not going to be upset about the ride. Wonderfully padded A-pillars as well. That would go away on the Mark IV, as you're going to see. So much went away on the Mark IV, unfortunately. Let's take that one for a ride. All right, we're off in the Mark IV, and one thing you can tell, the air conditioning's on high, and I put it on cold for a second. The fan is interior to the cabin on the Mark IV, and you definitely hear it way more than on the Mark III, where it's under hood. So first impression of this is that it's even smoother, like I said, than the Mark III, and quieter. And that car's already quiet. This does have a bit of a waterbeddy feel. Let's take a look. This is a rough patch of road here. You don't hear anything in the cabin at all. And no wind noise, no wind rush. I mean, Lexus level quiet, even by contemporary standards. Except for the HVAC motor, which when it's blowing at regular speed as it is now, it's not too bad. But with the recirc door open and on full blast, it can get noisy. I will say that in terms of squeaks and rattles, the Ford cars of this era I think are just better built than the GMs. This car doesn't have a creak or moan or rattle, nothing like that in it. And I can't say the same for the GMs. You also can close the door much more easily on these, and the hinge pins have a lot less tendency to sag than they do on the GM vehicles. But overall, I would say despite that it's not the Mark III, it's still an enjoyable experience.